Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.
Are you worried, Vitus?
About myself? No.
The girl?
Perhaps.
Oh. You're interested?
Maybe.
I thought so. Well, I'm not. Only spiritually.
Spiritually.
Tonight is the dark of the moon, and we shall gather and... You had better come, Vitus. The ceremony will interest you.
Don't pretend, Hjalmar. There was nothing spiritual in your eyes when you looked at that girl. You plan to keep her here.
Perhaps.
I intend to let her go.
Is that a challenge, Vitus?
Yes, if you dare to fight it out alone.
Do you dare play chess with me for her?
Yes. I will even play you chess for her. Provided if I win, they are free to go.
You won't win, Vitus.
Welcome to the projection booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me, of course, is Mr. Rob St. Mary.
I have a black cat. I call him Max.
Also with us this week is Ms. Maitland McDonagh.
I have a black cat. His name is Pan.
This week we are looking at the 1934 horror classic, The Black Cat, the first big American studio film and the last big American studio film directed by Edgar G. Ulmer. The film is a very loose adaptation of the Edgar Allan Poe short story and stars Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff in a taut game of life and death. Maitland, as our guest, when was the first time you saw The Black Cat and what did you think?
I think I probably saw The Black Cat for the first time when I was a kid on either Channel 9 or 11, which was the two local stations that showed old horror movies as part of a huge package of stuff that they didn't have to pay a lot of money for. But I remember seeing it quite late at night after everybody else was asleep. And I'm not sure that I knew precisely what to make of it, but I knew that it looked like nothing I had ever seen.
I think I probably saw bits of it over the years, but this is the first time I can remember sitting down and watching the whole thing all the way through, which doesn't take you that long because it's less than an hour. Just sort of reacquainting myself with it, I have to say it is quite good. Of course, it is 80 plus years old now and does have the feel of those early films. But I think for all of that, in terms of atmosphere and story and sort of the oddness that's in here, it really is kind of singular in a way. And plus, it also reminds me of that quote from the movie Ed Wood, where the assistant gets chewed out by the Bela Lugosi character played by Martin Landau over the, quote, sidekick comment.
You know which movie of yours I love, Mr. Lugosi? The Invisible Ray. You were great as Karloff's sidekick.
Karloff? Sidekick?
Fuck you! Karloff does not deserve to smell my shit! That limey cocksucker can rot in hell for all I care!
I saw this one for the first time, I think 2 years ago. They were doing one of these horror movie marathons in Chicago, and we actually did a little special about it, recorded it on the road, and it was very bizarre for me because I'm watching this movie, and all of a sudden I run into a line that I knew backwards and forwards. It was the line about...
Sounds like a lot of supernatural baloney to me.
Supernatural, perhaps. Baloney, perhaps not.
Which to me is like one of the great kind of like little laugh lines in here, which you don't really expect to come out of Lugosi's mouth.
And it's right from Head. The filmmakers of Head use that line during their kind of channel changing montages during that film. And so I knew that. And I think that line is even in our Head episode. And so I run into this quote that I had heard so many times before. And I was like, oh, okay, this is where this is from. But I was completely blown away by this movie. Yeah, it's only about an hour long. But the look of it, the pacing, just how much stuff is happening in this movie. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that it is only an hour long, but it's just packed to the gills with so many great things happening. And then pitting Karloff against Lugosi. This is 1934. They are pretty fresh off of their successes as Dracula and Frankenstein, and those two going head to head, just two, I consider, master thespians going at it in this just bizarro world that Ulmer created. I could not tell you how happy I was to see this for the first time, and it holds up. Every time I watch it, I get a little bit more out of it, and I just really enjoy this one.
Well, I think we need to talk about the stuff, because this movie is so unbelievably perverted. It is mind-boggling. What deviant behavior is not in this movie? Starting with necrophilia, incest. I don't even want to start the list because it'll make me sound like a more deviant person than I myself think of myself as being. But it is mind-boggling how perverse it is for a film made in 1934 by a mainstream Hollywood studio. The fact that movies like this were made under a reasonable degree of supervision. You know, there was very much an attitude that if you were working with filmmakers whom you knew could bring a movie in on time and on budget, you didn't sit on them throughout the production of a movie, but scripts were reviewed, everybody looked at them, and yet somehow this just sailed through with this unbelievable bounty of bizarre material in it that is here today for us to enjoy.
See, and my question on that is, as I was watching it, and I have to apologize, I mean, I should have looked it up, but I was like, this has to be a pre-code film. I mean, it's either that or it just got through the censors without a problem. And then on top of it, I cannot think of a film that directly relates to World War I so much. In that the film, you have Lugosi in the beginning, and he says, it's been this many years since I've been back here. In the war, and they keep mentioning the war, and if you do the math, it's 1919 versus the date of the release of the film. So there's this whole idea that, you know, the war shattered everyone. The war was this horrible thing that destroyed people's lives, and then there's even a line in there about, are these people any worse than those who had their, limbs torn off and things like that. So it really plays on this concept of just how shattering World War I was.
Oh, you're right. It plays into it absolutely directly. I mean, there is a point where one of them says, we are the living dead. We died on that hill during the war, and yet we're still walking around. It's really extraordinary. I mean, it has a kind of power that I think is absolutely analogous to the power of All Quiet on the Western Front, except that nobody went to this movie thinking, I'm going to see a movie about the First World War and about the effects of what we now call post-traumatic stress syndrome, but was then called shell shock. The way in which the horrors of that trench war absolutely destroyed people's minds and souls.
So just for the record, the Hays Code came into effect in 1930, so this was a post-code film.
Which is pretty amazing considering everything that's in here. I mean, given the length of it, I'm almost wondering if there was stuff that was even cut out, where there was stuff that was even crazier, and they're like, you got to get rid of X, Y, and Z. And it's like, okay, well, here's the movie we're left with, but we're still able to get, the other stuff through.
Well, from what I understand, they even went back in and did some reshoots after, like, an initial cut of it, and that's where some of those Brides of Karloff kind of come into it, which are just some of the strangest things. And yeah, that's kind of where, like, the necrophilia comes into it, and I didn't know what to make of these women in glass cages the first time that I saw it, and just these they looked like the living dead, kind of hanging out in this trophy type, hallway that of Karloff's. I mean, just it kind of took my breath away.
Well, I'm sure you didn't know what to make of it. You just couldn't quite believe it.
Yeah, it just it really struck me. Like, again, how can this be 1934? How can I be seeing this in this film that was made then? I mean, yes, Dracula and Frankenstein, very mature films. We know that there are very mature films that are coming out around this time, and this is one of the quote-unquote universal horror films, but it just strikes such a different tone. I mean, it has that gothic thing of a James Whale type movie, but it just takes it in a different direction. It just feels like it's almost like it's being played in a minor chord where those were the majors. It feels like everything is just kind of being twisted a little bit more and makes you feel a little bit more unsettled.
One of the things I love about it is that it is the quintessential old dark house movie, and yet the old dark house is this incredible Bauhaus-inspired modern construction sitting up on a hill. I mean, it's all glass brick and curving aluminum staircases and that incredible shiny floor that I don't know what it's made out of, but it's a very modern material. It really is this incredible collision of the old and the new when you look at the decor of this film that makes it more disturbing than if it were a conventional gabled and towered and widowed walked kind of house.
I want to know what you guys think of this as far as we have these two powerhouses that I've talked about before, Lugosi and Karloff, and they are both veterans of this war. One has imprisoned the other during the war, but at the heart of the movie are these newlyweds, Peter and Joan Allison, who come in, and they're our stand-in. They're the audience's stand-in for this stuff, but it was interesting to me that they're this American couple abroad, which it's like they are there for the tourism aspect, whereas Lugosi and Karloff, they're fighting old battles that have never been finished for them. They are definitely still, in that, as you said, the post-traumatic stress. They are still living out World War I.
Well, I mean, I think that the answer is in really how you phrase it. I mean, I think it might even be a commentary on sort of American involvement in World War I. They came over, they fought, and then they left. So they didn't have to live with the long-term effects in that way. I mean, there was some effects, right, but not the scarred, psyche that just continued to go on and on and on, I guess, in Europe post-war.
Well, and I think, as you said, the fact is, yes, people came home scarred by the war, but they didn't have to walk on the same streets and climb the same hills and go up to houses that they knew were built on piles of bodies and bones, because it all happened overseas. And that doesn't mean that there's no trauma, but it does mean that you're physically removed from, if you will, the scene of the crime. Whereas Lugosi and Karloff's characters here obviously grew up here, lived here, and came back here to the worst possible place they could have come back to. I mean, Lugosi's coming back after spending 15 years in a military prison, and 3 years before that on the front. Karloff is there having deserted his men, basically left them to die, made some kind of deal with the Russian soldiers, cut out, and come out of it pretty okay. I mean, the two of them are complete products of the absolutely visceral experience of that war, and they are still living in the midst of it.
And it goes even deeper with the whole idea that Karloff has stolen Lugosi's wife. And I'm not exactly sure what happens to the wife, though she seems to be well preserved as part of this mausoleum of women that Karloff has. But it's the daughter, and I'm not sure how old the daughter was when this all happened, but she is now living with Karloff. I'm assuming Karloff's lover, they're sleeping in the same bed. So there's that kind of weird perversion that's happening in this film as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think the daughter was probably 3 years old when the horrible trauma happened, and I think we can assume doesn't realize that her mother is embalmed in that bizarre modern art kind of case down in the basement. But still, she is clearly his lover, and the whole thing is just creepy, creepy, creepy. Starting from the first moment that you see Karloff rise out of the bed he shares with her.
I love when he rises out of bed. That beautiful silhouette of him coming up like Nosferatu, the way that he rises up out of that bed.
He's like a puppet on strings or something. There's something profoundly unnatural about it. And it is incredibly creepy at a point in the movie where you really don't know how creepy the stuff that's coming up is. It's your first real sign that there is something very, very wrong going on in this house.
There's something wrong with us. Something very, very wrong with us.
The way that the dialogue, I mean, the describe some of these things so beautifully. Like we were talking about the way that these, the castle is basically built on a burial ground, and to hear Lugosi talk about, tens of thousands of men died here. The ravine was piled 12 deep with dead, and the little river below was swollen red, a raging torrent of blood. That's one of the first images that we're being told about in this film. And it definitely is, it's not honeymoon talk. We've got our American couple kind of hanging out with Dr. Vitas, the Bela Lugosi character, and him laying this on them. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of history here, and to hear the way that he describes this stuff, and really so much of the dialogue in this film is as rich as that.
And actually, that particular descriptor is one that was drawn, I think, quite directly from history, though I think it might have been a French fort that was overrun in that way. So there's a real level of realism there. And the way in which the scene in their carriage is staged is really remarkable, because they're sunk in darkness for most of it. And there are just these odd flashes of light that light up their faces. It is incredibly film noir looking a full 6 years before Stranger on the Third Floor, I think is the title, the film that most people consider the first true noir film was made. It is incredibly noir in its look from beginning to end.
The one thing about the woman in the glass case kind of thing had me thinking of, and I don't think he was dead then, but had me thinking of like Lenin. Like how they embalm these dictators in certain places and then, save their bodies, and really had a feeling of taxidermy, which is what I kind of consider, Lenin's tomb to be all about in this particular way.
Which it certainly is, and that's a culture that goes all the way back to the Egyptians, the idea that if you preserve people's bodies, you preserve their souls and their essence, which is a fundamentally creepy thing, because it basically means that the living are living among the dead, and that the dead have this kind of special stature. They're embodying the people they were when they were alive, except that I think most everybody can see that they are these bizarre simulacra, even if they are the real bodies. They've been converted into something that's not anything that ever lived, really.
And correct me if I'm wrong, aren't they hanging from their hair?
I don't know about that, and I was actually thinking about it when I rewatched it, because their hair has a real Bride of Frankenstein look. It definitely appears to be suspended in some way, but there aren't a lot of really close shots that let you see what's going on inside those cases, whether maybe there's some liquid in there that they're suspended in, or whether, I don't know. Quite honestly, I couldn't figure it out physically.
Yeah, that was the thought that I had, was the whole sort of, Nefertiti look, Bride of Frankenstein idea. And this is obviously a year or so before that movie came out.
I love the whole idea. You talked about this reminding you of Lenin a little bit. I was also reminded of a film that would come a few more years later. I was also reminded of the chess game in The Seventh Seal, because it really does feel like there's more at stake than obviously a chess game. And there are lives at stake in this chess game, but it really does feel like Lugosi's soul is on the line when it comes to this game that we have them playing, Lugosi and Karloff, through this film. And it's just, it's a fairly obvious metaphor, but it just worked for me. That seeing these two guys sit down and just kind of play the mind game as well as the physical game just really did it for me.
It's a very physical manifestation of the war of the souls that's going on. And although I'm sure somebody could come up and say, oh, right, they're playing a chess game. Oh, that's such a cliche. It doesn't play like a cliche at all. It plays like an intellectual game, which is, of course, what, chess is the quintessential game of minds. There's very little cheating in chess. If you're cheating, you're going to get caught. It really is a game of infinite strategy, which is why I was always so bad at it. I could play 2 moves ahead, but beyond that, it was like, forget it. So I was never, ever going to win a game against anybody good. It's a long game, and you can see that metaphorically, that's what Vidas Verdigast and Hjalmar Poeldig are playing. They're playing a long game. It's a game that has its roots 15 years ago, 20 years ago almost, and they're going to play it out to the end.
Yeah, and chess obviously is a war metaphor as well in terms of the pieces and everything, and about fighting on two sides and all of that stuff, and the idea of pawns and who are the pawns, you know, the use of the metaphor of a pawn in the game, and sacrificing one piece for another to make a larger move later. So that's, you know, you can read many different things in there. I think, like you were saying, the idea of it being a cliche, I think would be used in modern time, but I think 1934, I don't think that would be as played out, because people wouldn't have seen that in film, or maybe even in other places in media or books or things like that, as its use as a stand-in, as a symbolism.
I think you're right. It was absolutely not a cliche in film then, although I think it already had a pretty solid history in literature. Film was a new medium and allowed you to actually show a chess game. And on the one hand, you can say, well, there are a few things less exciting than showing a chess game, because it is two people sitting on either side of a board thinking for a really long time and then moving a piece. But in fact, there is an incredible concentrated kind of energy to chess that I think is very suited to film.
And I kind of wonder if some of the other people that are in this movie, because we've really concentrated on the two, but there are a host of other characters that are involved in this thing, and I kind of wonder if they are almost, you know, the pawns when it comes to this, because the Peter and Joan characters, yes, they are our foils. We do experience this through them. But then we have some of the other characters like the Major Domo or Tamal or the young Verdigast girl, who, as far as I know, has her mother's name. So she's Karen the mother and Karen the younger, and also it's the same actress playing both, which is another kind of weird twist to it. So it's almost like it is kind of I don't know, incestuous or necrophilia kind of stuff there, when you're sleeping with the daughter who looks like the mother, and the mother is preserved in a glass case. Just, I want to call up my therapist and talk about this kind of stuff, because it is just absolutely out there.
I think it plays completely into the way Poeldig is characterized, because he's somebody who has constructed a complete, artificial, fully realized world around himself. And I think to him, the mother and the daughter are interchangeable. They're just things. They are like chess pieces that he can move around. So the fact that there are two Karens really doesn't even bother him in the way it would bother anybody remotely normal. It's just part of the world that he's built around himself within that house, built on that pile of bones. And it's very, very creepy. It's very psychologically disturbing in a way that I think people have written about it, but I think often when people write about the Black Cat, they write about the style of it above the psychological intensity of it. And I think it's actually very intense, quite honestly.
I have to say that the Satanism angle always takes me by surprise. Even though I've seen this film multiple times now, I always forget that there's going to be a satanic ritual pretty much dead center in this film. And it's like, okay, where did this come from?
Where that came from was Aleister Crowley, who was very much in the news at that time for his temple of, what was it, Thoth or Thelema or whatever it was. You know, he managed to make quite a scandal by being the Satanist du jour, with all his proclamations and his kind of harem of women. And it was a big thing that was in the press. So I think that's the origin of the satanic aspect of this film. I don't think that most Americans, for example, really had any keen sense that Satanism was something they should be worried about, that they should be concerned that maybe the couple down the road whom they thought were a little odd might be Satanists. But it did play into, I think, an idea about European decadence, things that were going on in places that weren't America, that I think Ulmer chose to harness for this film.
Yeah, they weren't playing their records backward on the Victrola just yet at that time, I guess.
I'll slow this down a little bit. Listen for Here's to My Sweet Satan.
Here's to my sweet Satan. Y'all hear that?
Yeah, Satanism in America wasn't invented till the 1970s, I think. That's when Peter Fonda and Warren Oates were running away from them.
The American stuff probably has to do with like fallout post Manson, and then those crazy hippies that got a little too strange as the 80s wore on.
Rob, we've actually seen part of this movie. When we covered Mock-Up on Moo, there's a scene of this satanic ritual going on as a stand-in for what Crowley was doing, so it all kind of plays back on itself. Crowley was the inspiration, as Maitland was just saying, and then Craig Baldwin used this to kind of represent what Crowley was up to, even to the point where he was the one, for me, who pointed out John Carradine on the organ at the satanic ritual, which I had never noticed until I saw Mock-Up on Moo.
In this film, John Carradine.
Exactly.
Yeah, because Carradine's in, he's in what, Bride of Frankenstein or Frankenstein? I can't remember which.
I don't remember him being in either of those, but he might have been.
Yeah, I think he was in one of those early Universal films. It would have been in The Culture because he was getting attention and all of that stuff, and was still around, actually. I think he was still doing his thing, would be Crowley, until the 40s. I think he died sometime in the 40s.
No, actually, he lived quite well beyond that. I mean, he really did work that satanic thing for decades. And actually, the other person that you have to think of looking at Karloff's character is Anton LaVey, because I swear he must have seen this film when he was putting together his handbook for things that good Satanists wore. Karloff's wardrobe, absolutely the Anton LaVey wardrobe.
The only thing he's missing is the shaved head.
And Karloff has that great widow's peak going on here, where he just looks like a monster, even without the makeup.
But he also looks like a piece of modernist architecture, which is what's kind of great. I mean, it's all angles and shadows, which is fabulous. I also love that medallion that he's wearing when he conducts the Black Mass. I don't know if you remember it, but it's kind of a U-shaped piece of wire with two little loops on the top. Quite honestly, it looks like a cock and balls. And then there's an upside-down star inside of it. It's really quite elegant and yet quite vulgar at the same time.
Yeah, I think Anton LaVey would approve.
Oh, absolutely. My God, he would have put it on every curtain in his house.
The other thing that I love in here, and this has more to do with the credits, is the fact that Karloff is just listed as Karloff, just one name, like Madonna or something.
Well, I think that was kind of the post-Karloff, the Uncanny era, where, he was still a one-name star, but he didn't have to have an adjective anymore.
If memory serves, wasn't he billed as question mark in Frankenstein? I'm trying to remember. There was a weird credit for that one.
Yeah, he was not listed. He's got a question mark, yeah. So they were trying to play up on, was it a real... I think it was kind of a play off the whole sort of Max Schreck thing in Nosferatu, where, it's like, wow, the guy really did look like that. It wasn't makeup kind of thing. It was like the marketing around the Blair Witch back in the late 90s. Hey, this is real.
We caught real Satanists on tape doing their horrific rituals and trying to, and I should say that, Joan is in danger here when it comes to this stuff, because it sounds like her virtue is going to be at stake when it comes to this.
Well, it sounds that quite precisely. I mean, Lugosi says to Karloff, your look was anything but spiritual when you looked at that girl. So it's pretty clear that he's got the number there. Kind of
beating the drum when it comes to this whole thing of, isn't it strange that this early film was so perverse? But it just is so striking to me. Yes, I understand that people were very sophisticated in the 1930s. But again, to Rob's point earlier, this is a postcode film. I think that this was one of those films that really made the Hays Code kind of buckle down because it was just so out there when it came to this, because we haven't even gotten to me, what is the most terrifying part of the movie. And I'm not talking about the black cats that scare the bejesus out of Bela Lugosi at every left and right turn. Do you think that the black cats were just kind of there as a remnant of the Poe story, or are we seeing anything more to those cats?
I had a weird sort of first view when I went through it. I was like, is this some sort of sexual metaphor in some way? Because I thought the way Lugosi and Karloff kind of look at each other and some of their early dialogue almost implied some sort of homoerotic stuff going on between them, and then the cat shows up and he's scared of the cat. So obvious, like, the cat is a stand-in for lady parts. I was like, what's going on here with these two guys leering at each other, and then I'm scared of cats.
Oh, well, let me just come out and say it. There's that scene where Karloff is walking through the gallery of dead women stroking a pussy. I mean, what can you say?
Strange about the cat. Jones seemed so curiously affected when you killed it. I had no idea that he killed the cat until they said that.
Yeah.
And it is odd how completely unhorrified they are by that. I mean, you know, he killed the cat with a dagger. I'd be really upset by that.
Yeah, I mean, in today's world, the whole film would be about, what the hell is your problem? Why did you kill the cat? They'd spend like a half hour on that in the film.
You cat killer, you. You know, that would be his defining characteristic. And yet it's essentially just it's an aside, almost, in the character building there. He has a horror of cats, and therefore he threw a dagger at one and killed it. I want to say, dude, get a grip.
Congratulations, because those things are pretty wily. I mean, I've thrown, like, you know, toys at my cats and never been able to hit them because they move around too fast.
No daggers?
No daggers, come on. I love my cats. Although I do have a friend of mine that when I was watching this, I'm like, I totally have to send this to Noah, because every time he would come over, he would call my black cat Max the devil. So I'm like, here you go. You and Lugosi got something going on here, pal.
Let's go ahead and talk about the end of this film. If you haven't seen this film, spoiler alert, because, it's only 80-some years old, but here we go anyway. The flaying alive scene, my God, my jaw was on the floor the first time that I saw this. I could not believe what I was seeing. I could not believe that here we go, Lugosi getting his revenge against Karloff, and he's going to whip the skin off of his back. And they shot it so effectively that I couldn't believe that they could have this in this film.
Well, maybe that's the payoff for the cats. I mean, the old saying, more than one way to skin a cat. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to figure out. I mean, the cats, as I said for the title, you would think would make a bigger point within the structure of the film, but it just, like I said, we kind of belabored that point. But maybe that's part of the reason why he was like, hey, let's see if we can put that skin the cat metaphor in here.
I was actually looking at it, and all I could think of was Hellraiser, which is certainly many decades beyond the atrocities of this film. But I really thought, wow, that's like the flaying of Frank, which is kind of pretty goddamn horrifying. And even though you don't see very much in this film, what you do see is extremely impressive. It absolutely gives you the sense of what's going on, and it's completely horrifying.
Jesus wept.
And this is just one of those moments where you're like, my God, Edgar Ulmer knew how to direct. This really can take you to a place where you didn't expect to go.
I think that's probably the effect the Black Cat has on most people who are not the kind of, I'm trying to think of a word for it that, I'm just going to go for asshole. People who aren't the kind of assholes who think, oh, all black and white movies are boring, so I don't like them. But anybody who is unencumbered by that prejudice looking at the Black Cat, I think really has to be gobsmacked by it, because it is an astonishing movie in the places it's willing to go.
Does this film end with an explosion?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the way the explosions look actually remind me of, and I think it was restaged footage, or it was footage that I remember seeing from early films of, like, bombs going off in World War I. Like, it actually, with the hill and the way the explosions are done, looks like the war in a way.
And certainly there is a whole lead up. I mean, 2 or 3 times at least, people refer to the fact that the entire house is connected to some mountain of dynamite somewhere. So you want to be careful about lighting fires and shooting off guns. And there are levers on walls that if you pull them, they're going to set off this incredible explosive exchange that will destroy everything.
The self-destruct buttons.
Yep, it's the self-destruct button.
Big shiny red button. Whatever you do, don't push that button.
Yep, it's the one that has "Do Not Touch" written under it in really huge letters. Yeah, that one.
Oh, how long can trusty Cadet Stimpy hold out?
How can he possibly resist the diabolical urge to push the button that could erase his very existence? Will his tortured mind give in to its uncontrollable desires? Can he withstand the temptation to push the button that even now beckons him ever closer? Will he succumb to the maddening urge to eradicate history at the mere push of a single button? The beautiful, shiny button! The jolly, candy-like button! Will he hold out, folks? Can he hold out?
But the thing is, although it's actually very funny, it also does play into, again, the larger psychology of the film, which is that both Vertigast and Polzig are completely destroyed by their wartime experience. And one of them has been in a jail that he could not control all these years, and the other one has built himself a jail that's completely filled with, walls that are attached to dynamite. So he's built himself a house that at any moment could explode. It's a startling symmetry, I think.
And surrounded himself with trophies of dead women, and I don't know his relationship with the other women, but we have the relationship to the one that we know for sure. So he's in a hell of his own making, whereas Lugosi seems to be in a hell of Karloff's making. It's very appropriate that they end up destroyed at the end of this movie because, as you said, they were destroyed going into it. They were the Walking Dead. So there's no better way for this thing to end. It's not one of those, atomic Superman, every film must end with an explosion kind of thing, but it was one of the more appropriate explosions at the end of a horror film.
Absolutely. It's the explosion that you know is coming from the moment that you begin to understand who those two characters are. I mean, you know that there can be no good ending to this. The best possible ending is that maybe these poor young Americans might be able to get away unscathed. But that's it. Even they are not unscathed. I'm sorry, no matter how happy they look at the end, you don't walk away from that kind of thing and be, hey, I'm okay. We were on our honeymoon. We met this guy on the train. We were tortured. We were terrified. We were trapped. But that's okay. We're fine now. We're going to go meet my mom in Vienna.
All's well that ends well. Isn't that what the old Shakespeare said?
Yes, precisely.
By the time we get to Vienna, it'll all be a distant memory.
It'll just be a good story to tell people at parties. It's a shame we don't have any slides we can show them.
The thing that I also like about the film is it has basically a postscript, because the film could have ended with the explosion of the house and all of that, but no, it ends with the couple on the train, and they're reading what appears to be a film review. So it actually ends with a criticism of another film or another project in a way, and them sort of discussing it just a bit.
It's actually a book review. The husband is a writer of mystery novels, and it's a review of his new novel that suggests that, the plot twists he's thought out really are preposterous, and it would be really good if in future he could confine himself to things that people could believe, as opposed to what's just happened to them.
Yeah, so I kind of like that. I like the idea of using a critique to sort of end the piece and have this sort of, little humorous aside at the end to go, hey, these people don't know what they're talking about because crazy stuff happens.
But what I also like is that it doesn't have the kind of music that could easily accompany that sort of ending and make it seem silly, the sort of mwahaha music. You were left seeing that couple and realizing that they see the humor in the situation, but they also just got out of hell on earth. So it's not that funny to them.
Yeah, I think it's more funny to us than to them, which is good.
All right, we're going to take a break and play a pair of interviews. With the first, we'll hear from Noah Isenberg, the author of Edgar G. Ulmer, a filmmaker at the margins. In the second, we'll hear from our old friend Ed Pettit about Edgar Allan Poe and how The Black Cat stacks up against its source material. And you'll hear both of those right after these brief messages.
It was a childhood corrupted by endless hours of VHS rentals.
For sake, the man of this, you'd love it.
In his most formative years, he had seen it all.
I can handle anything.
Action.
Karate is not to be used aggressively. But if I have no other choice.
Horror. And romance. Now, he's decided it's time to go back. For just one more adventure.
Humans are such an easy prey.
Noel Mellor presents...
You're the problem, you live in a shit.
The Adventures in VHS podcast.
Join me, Noel Mellor, as each month I take an in-depth look at one movie from my collection of ex-rental 80s VHS classics and speak to one or two of the people involved with making them about what the format means to them.
The Adventures in VHS podcast.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Download today from iTunes by searching for Adventures in VHS or visit adventuresinvhs.com.
Scientists, newsmakers, policy changers, advocates, and more. Join me, international award-winning journalist Michael Howie, as I interview those in the know on wildlife issues and advocacy around the world on Defender Radio. Posted every Monday on the iTunes Store and at furbeardefenders.com. Listen to Defender Radio, and you too can stay informed and stay strong. Presented by Gates Wildlife Control and the Association for the Protection of Fur-Bearing Animals.
Hello from Cinema Detroit, Metro Detroit's only truly independent cinema. We deliver an eclectic mix of current indie, genre, cult, and classic movies in the heart of the city. Like a sommelier choosing wine for his or her guests, we handpick our slate of films, many of which are exclusive to the metro area, the state of Michigan, or occasionally the entire Midwest region. Cinema Detroit features a unique setting in a former school and a warm hometown atmosphere, including always fresh popcorn, Detroit-made Faygo soda, and other locally created treats. Please visit our website, cinemadetroit.com, for the latest features and showtimes. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Tumblr. We look forward to seeing you soon at 3420 Cass Avenue in Midtown Detroit, 48201.
What was the first Ulmer film that you saw?
It's funny. I think it may have actually been The Black Cat. I think that I saw The Black Cat many years ago, and I may have even seen it before then, but I think I saw it and have it in memory when I was studying Weimar cinema at UC Berkeley in the early 90s, and somebody had told me, "Oh, you got to see this movie because it really is. It's a funny throwback in a way to Weimar, but made in the U.S. There are all sorts of these, it's kind of the afterlife of Weimar." And I said, "Oh, I should go see it," and I checked it out. And I think that's the first time I saw it was in the 90s. I was TAing for a Weimar cinema class, and I watched it just to see what the person who told me about it, what he meant. I think it actually may have been my dissertation advisor. But I may have watched it earlier, one of those Saturday matinees, or the many times that the film was broadcast during my childhood. I may have also I saw a lot of horror films as a kid, and I may have seen it then, but I'm not sure. I can't remember which Lugosi Karloff movie it was, and they all kind of become one after enough viewings, and so. But I believe The Black Cat may have been the first Ulmer film, unless prior to that I had seen Menschen am Sonntag, People on Sunday, which is his late Weimar silent that he co-directed with Robert Siodmak. And then Detour came soon after, but I think those are the first films that I saw by Ulmer.
Now, this was Ulmer. It wasn't his first foray into American filmmaking. He did the Damaged Lives film before this.
But that was done for the Canadian, Hygiene Council, I think is what it was called. So I'm not sure you'd really call that. I mean, that's more of a curio on his, CV than it is an actual full-fledged feature film made for an American studio. So Damaged Lives, which is, was completed the year before, 1933, it was made for this Canadian Social Hygiene Council. There was a guy there named Dr. Gordon Bates, who was the head of the Canadian Social Hygiene Council, and I think he had a hand, and there were these guys, the Cohn brothers, C-O-H-N, who were connected to Columbia, but the film was really, it was an independent. And so the first foray into, and it was a brief first, and it turns out to be last foray into, studio direction, was The Black Cat in 1934. That was what looked to be at the time, when he made the film, what looked to be a very auspicious beginning to what, of course, he'd hoped would be, I think, a long career working inside the studio system. And as we all know by now, that was not the case, for better and possibly for worse. But when he was tapped to direct this film in early 1934, he was sort of a precocious young emigre in Hollywood who looked to be at the beginning of a very, very promising career. The way that things played out with this picture, not only his choice to stuff the film with classical music that he did with the working in collaboration with Heinz Rohmheld, who later scored Yankee Doodle Dandy less than a decade later and picked up an Oscar for that. But it was really a very talented European-trained composer. So not only did he stuff the film almost every single minute of the, little over an hour of screen time filled with that classical score, but also just all of these German touches, the lighting, just the way that he handled, would have, I think, and perhaps was for some at least, and certainly for Uncle Carl, for Carl Laemmle, considered to be just too gruesome in the way that he handled those very, very violent scenes, but did so by aestheticizing violence in a way, in the sense that, if you take, for instance, the scene in which you have Bela Lugosi being basically flayed by Boris Karloff, and we don't actually see, but we see the hands, and we see the shadows, and we see, I don't think that's what Uncle Carl had in mind when he gave young Edgar Ulmer the assignment to direct, before he took off then for the spas in Europe. So you have both of those things, and then on top of it, as I write about at some length in the biography, he goes ahead and falls in love with Shirley, then Shirley Alexander, married to Uncle Carl Laemmle's beloved nephew Max Alexander, and so. If he hadn't already done enough with his classical score and with all of these kind of Germanic, aesthetic flourishes and aesthetic touches, he certainly didn't curry any favor by running off with the wife of his beloved nephew, Max Alexander, who later would become Shirley Ulmer and would be Edgar's lifelong collaborator and, the script supervisor on pretty much every picture he directed. And that's essentially what she was doing during the production of The Black Cat, was training with Maury Herring to become a script supervisor, or what they called at the time a script girl. That's, and if you follow his whole career, in 1934 it looks like he's about to be sort of catapulted to fame and fortune, and obviously things don't follow that trajectory.
When Ulmer came over, when he emigrated from Europe, was he part of that whole wave of people who were either being persecuted or afraid of being persecuted?
Well, that's a good question. Now, he arrived in Hollywood already in the mid-20s. It's April 24 is when he arrives in Ellis Island. He makes his way west as quickly as he possibly can. I think he ends up out in the movie colony by late 24, and that's when he starts working at Universal in the art department, collaborating with, among others, this guy Danny Hall, who does the sets together with Ulmer for The Black Cat. That's a British-born art director, Charles D., but he went by Danny Hall. And so, I think it would be overstating it a bit to say that Ulmer fled to the U.S. because he was, persecuted as a Jew or feared persecution. But when he was here, and with the rise of Hitler, he was definitely attuned to what was going on. So, on the one hand, no, he was not one of those, refugees who arrived on these shores after January of 1933, after Hitler's rise to power. But he was nonetheless, like Lubitsch and Paul Kohner and these others who became involved in what was called the European Film Fund, he was very attuned to that and was eager to do what he could, I think. And you see that in some of his PRC pictures after America's entry to the war. They're really the sort of anti-fascism pictures. Tomorrow We Live, for instance. And so he was, I think, politically aware, even if most of his family at that point in time had already made it to the U.S., and he wasn't fearing, as were many of his fellow Austrian or German-born, even Austro-Hungarian-born directors, actors, cinematographers, and so forth who were in Hollywood, fearing for their relatives. I think that wasn't so much the case with him, but he was nonetheless attuned to what was going on there, and was, I think, he was unsettled by it, no doubt. I mean, that's an understatement. I mean, I think he was really pretty. What I can tell you is after the U.S. entry to the war, at the very latest, this is when Ulmer was lobbying for U.S. and then he very soon after took on U.S. citizenship. But even before then, he stopped speaking the German language. He just refused to speak it. So this would have been sometime between, I'm guessing sometime so Hitler seizes power in January of 1933. Ulmer makes this film a year later in 1934. I think it's sometime in the late 1930s that he just decided that he was no longer going to speak German. And his daughter Ariane says that he would only use it to count and to swear. but apart from that, he really pretty much abandoned his what had prior to that been his beloved language. And he returned to it later after the war. But there was a period when he refused to even speak the language. So that should give you some sense. Even if he was among the fortunate in terms of arriving here with first on his own and then having his sisters and brothers and mother even make their way to the U.S. So he was among the fortunate there. I mean, I'm sure he had relatives. I couldn't count them for you, but I'm sure he had relatives who perished at the hands of the Nazis. But I don't know of him speaking directly to that in any of his private writing or even anecdotal information. I just know that he was deeply, deeply unsettled by what was taking place there, and I think you can see some of that in The Black Cat, and especially in that that the parts of the script that were never that he was never really able to shoot, and the film it's his first foray into sort of relatively large budget, and certainly studio Ulmer working at Universal, that was a pretty big break for him. It wasn't MGM, it wasn't Paramount, it wasn't RKO, but it was certainly a respectable studio. And this was his chance to make a name for himself. And you could see in the script, he was working together with Peter Urich, who, was a relatively inexperienced screenwriter who'd written a few pulps and had contributed to Black Mask and other magazines, writing under the pseudonym Paul Kane. When he and Rurik crafted that screenplay in early 1934, they both put in a lot of kind of personal touches in it. For Ulmer, there was, the opening scene was not to be at the Budapest train station, but was to be at a church. I think it was the Stephansdom, if I'm not mistaken. But the cathedral in the heart of Vienna, where Joan and Peter were married. And so you have this kind of return to his former home. And you even have it with the Budapest railway station scene, those shots. But had he been left his own device, he would have shot that opening scene in Vienna, the city with which he most identified, even if he'd been born in the provinces and Olmütz, in truth. But he always claimed to have been from Vienna, and that's really where he grew up, and that's where his mother was born, and so it makes sense. So, in this film, he, I think, wanted to retrace certain steps of his in a way, and you have that in the script. There were a number of you asked about the connection to Nazism, and there were a number of sort of allusions, not so subtle even, allusions to what was happening in Germany at the time. And there were all of these characters who then ultimately got cut, but who had, kind of basically stepped out of a central casting of for the Third Reich, and they didn't end up getting to do this, but Ulmer, I think already at the time, and this is very early, 1934, when most Hollywood studios were not exactly doing pictures that dealt with the rise of National Socialism, that was something that was certainly on his mind, and in a number of ways that even, these things made it into the script, even if they then ended up on the proverbial, cutting room floor. But he was definitely thinking about those matters. Looking for all the different names. I don't know them by heart, but I could, the different names of the figures that he had in that shooting script of his that didn't make it. But I can't remember whether there was a Heydrich. Let's see here. We have there's a Frau Göring. That's it. Who was to be played by a woman with a dark fuzz on her lip, suggesting Hitler's mustache. That's it. And a Fräulein Krug and a Graf Trivers, and so he was definitely, at least, if not directly and kind of harshly, in a more sort of political mindset, was at least playfully dealing with these sort of questions and what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. And I mean, that's again just on the purely aesthetic level, whether it's in the music or whether it's in the visual flourishes of the film, I think you can see that he's still kind of working through his past. In this picture, that he's sort of kind of pivoting between his new identity as one of the many newly arrived film professionals in Hollywood, and someone who still is deeply invested, at least culturally and intellectually, in his European past.
The war that Vettergast and Pulzig are still playing out. Is that World War I that we're seeing absolutely. Continued?
Yes.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no, very much so. These are two veterans of that so-called Great War, and that Fort Mamarosh, on top of which Herr Poe, built his compound, is this graveyard, and it's one of the many graveyards of the First World War. And that is I don't want to necessarily put poor Edgar on the psychoanalytic couch, but that's the war that he knew firsthand, because his father in 1916 in Austrian uniform had died of kidney failure on the Italian front. And Edgar, as a very young, impressionable young man, was responsible for being sent there and helping to return his father's remains. And so he was definitely acutely aware of the atrocities that had been committed already in that, first industrialized war fought on European soil. And, I think felt the rather acutely felt the loss of that war in the figure of his father. He was 12 years old when his father passed away. He was really a young boy. I'm not the first to point this out. There's a wonderful piece that Bill Crone did in Film Comment in '84, when there was this King of the Bees series that started out at UCLA and then traveled throughout the country. And in that piece by Bill Crone, that was published on that very title, the same title of the series, called King of the Bees, he was the first, to my mind, who made reference to the fact that so many of Ulmer's films, you have these absent fathers. The Black Cat isn't necessarily one of them, but I think that on a much more latent level here, what Ulmer is dealing with in this ongoing struggle, this battle between Vettergast and Poe, is this kind of working through of the trauma of the First World War. There are many other films in which, from like Jive Junction to Ruthless to several others in which you really the absent father is much more obvious and much more central to the plot line and to the kind of psychological disposition of the figures portrayed on screen. But that was definitely something that I think that Ulmer was. I mean, to the degree that when in Hollywood, just within the next year, when he writes this unpublished novel called Beyond the Boundary, and he dedicates it to his father, and says very specifically that this is something that to his how did he put it? He dedicates his father, one of the many fallen soldiers or something along those lines of the First World War. He dates it Hollywood 35, so just a year after The Black Cat. He says, to one of the many thousand soldiers who died in the First World War, in memoriam to Siegfried Ulmer, my father. So that's a year later, but he was definitely thinking about this, I would say, in the run-up to putting words to the page for that unpublished novel of his, Beyond the Boundary, which he shot through with references to the sort of ravages of the First World War and the bread lines and the brothels in Vienna and things of that nature, things that he really couldn't, I think, include in filming The Black Cat. And yet again, they're there subterraneously, and they're even there on the surface. And for instance, in the depiction of this Fort Mamarosh and just these bodies, and again, in terms of these allusions to Weimar cinema, I mean that one wonderful scene where the driver, the Austrian driver, is speaking to him in very, very thick accented English and talking about these ravines and the deaths just before driving off the road and having that accident. I mean it's a Dutch actor, and I'm blanking out his name at the moment, but he really could not look any more like Emil Jannings in The Last Laugh. Everything from the way that he holds his umbrella during the rainstorm to his mutton chops and just the way that he kind of comports himself in general. So, I mean, I think they're and even and in politics too. I mean, these are just they're kind of a litany, I would say, of references to the glory days of Weimar cinema. But Petzig, was one of the great architects. Hjalmar Petzig was his name, who had designed the Großes Schauspielhaus, the Great Theater in Berlin, and then who also did, he collaborated in motion pictures, doing the set design for, among others, doing Paul Wegener's third Golem film, The Golem, How They Came Into the World of 1920, and doing those really, really extraordinary sets that he constructed. And so calling this figure Petzig is really a direct reference to this Hjalmar Petzig. So to Hans Petzig, rather. Hans Petzig was the name of the actual actor. Hjalmar is what Karloff is called. But yeah, I mean, I think it is a very. These were maybe meant to be kind of inside jokes for the increasingly large crowd of emigres in Hollywood, but I think there was more to it than just that. I think he also was trying to kind of continue to assert his ties to that golden era of picture making and thereby grant himself access maybe to new projects and to different corners of Hollywood that he otherwise would not have access to. And so it was sort of, in a way, it was kind of I think a larger part of this calling card that he was trying to craft for himself while in Hollywood. So even if he didn't have as much as he claimed in that very famous, two-part interview with Peter Bogdanovich, didn't have as many ties to these storied productions of the 1920s in Weimar Germany, he at least identified with them, and there is a distinct possibility that as a youngster he may have even, helped in what today I think would be kind of more of a PA capacity, a production assistant capacity. Or perhaps he did actually cut out silhouettes on the Golem when he would have been a mere teenager. It's hard to know, but I mean that interview with Bogdanovich is just another example. I think it's very late in life, and Ulmer had already suffered from a number of strokes at that point. But I think that what he's doing there is not terribly different from what he's doing already in 1934, namely trying to position himself as someone who's very much a part of that larger kind of cultural heritage and that sort of cinematic lineage that leads from 1920s Europe, in particular Germany, to Hollywood. And that's why I think his apprenticeship with Murnau is so important, even though it fittingly enough takes place in Hollywood. And so in 1927 when he, together with Rochus Griese, works in the art direction and set design on Sunrise, that's a really important moment, I think, for Ulmer, just in terms of his sense of self and his aspirations and just his general training as a filmmaker. And I think he always saw himself as being, and I think of the words of Andrew Saris, as being the sort of the rightful heir to the Murnau estate. And I think that you can see quite a bit of Murnau in the Black Cat too, just again purely on an aesthetic level.
There's so many striking visuals in the Black Cat. I mean, I'm thinking especially of the women in their kind of glass coffins in that hallway. Oh my God, it's just so unsettling. Yeah. I mean, and that too, again, in terms of really angering Uncle Karl Lemle when he returned from one of his annual trips to the spas in what was then still Czechoslovakia. I mean, I think that seeing what Ulmer did there was quite shocking. I mean, visually, just as you say, unsettling and striking, but also I think it was Uncle Karl was not prepared for that. And as I gave the example before, also just some of this, the way that he handled the violence in the film. It's amazing when you think about it. I mean, this is right around the time the Breen office, the Hays Code is beginning to be enforced, and it's amazing. I went through the code files for all the films that Ulmer made from 34 onward, and in this particular case, they were really pretty lenient. I mean, they were worried about, and this is something that was quite common at that time. They were worried about the possible offenses considered the depiction of these soldiers. You have that kind of Borscht Belt shtick of the soldiers who arrive on the scene, and they're in Austrian uniform. And I think that there's a note in the file that's worried that this might be considered as some sort of defamation, cultural defamation. So there's concern about that, but there is concern too. I discussed this in the biography. There's concern that there can't be any suggestion of homosexual, erotic relationship, between Karloff and Lugosi. And that's much later. Harry Bensoff writes this book on homosexuality and horror, and he speaks of Karloff and Lugosi in this film as this queer sadomasochistic couple. And the Breen office was definitely concerned about that. There was also concern, however, about there's that scene when Karloff is in bed and he's lying next to Lucille Lund, who's much younger than he is, who's wearing very, very little, and there was concern too of the sexual suggestiveness of that particular scene. That's the scene where when after the accident, when they arrive at Poe's compound, and he rises from his sleep again, almost as if he were being, this is sort of a throwback to not only to Nosferatu, if we go to Murnau, but also to, Dracula and Frankenstein, just the way that he rises from his sleep there. That's an extraordinary shot too. But the more to the point concerning the code enforcement of the code is that he's lying in bed with Lucille Lund, who's very, very scantily clad. And later, in the film, and you were mentioning this moments before, when they're in the gun turrets and they go and he gives this tour, and you see these women who are hanging in her case, hanging by her hair. It's really quite extraordinary that they were able to make this film and get it through the Breen office and get it into the theaters as they managed to do. I mean, when you watch it today, sure, it's nowhere near as gory as contemporary horror film or horror film from the past few decades. But it's. I
find in certain ways it's much more terrifying. I mean, particularly that scene that I've now referenced before when I think I've even misidentified it, but I think it's when Prozig has, excuse me, when Vertigo says Prozig on that rack and is, you know, playing him, and you see the hands. I think before I said that it was Prozig who had Vertigo, but you know, when he's seeking revenge, it's a pretty, you know, I would say pretty terrifying scene. I mean, again, maybe nothing in comparison to what's been made in that particular arena in the past few decades. But I think, despite the you know, what can now be shown on screen, I think it's, you know, this is one of those many instances when the code actually forced directors and their technical crews to be more imaginative, and I think it's that imaginative horror in this film that's actually so terrifying. It's not really what's shown; it's what's suggested.
I just saw the movie for the first time probably about 2 years ago, and it really got to me. It just really affected me so much, and especially, that fleeing scene. And I was always curious if that had been cut or if it was shot the way that it was shot.
That's a good question. I don't know whether they cut there. I don't believe so. I don't recall coming across in the files at Universal, I don't recall coming across any mention of the cutting. There were other things that were of course cut, but I think it was shot the way that, you know, the shooting script, I think it pretty much adhered closely to that. I don't believe that there were any major cuts, and I don't, you know, oddly enough, again, going through the, you know, the PCA files, the Production Code Administration files, I don't recall seeing any major demands there. It packs a pretty strong punch for, you know, a film that barely stretches over 67 minutes and that was made in 34. It's pretty damn terrifying. And, you know, it's funny, it's one of those films that has mainly because it's part of the Universal horror cycle, because it's, you know, the first of whatever it was, 8 pictures in which Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, you know, played opposite of one another. You know, it has a kind of cult following, and it often makes the rounds at different horror festivals. Ulmer, after making this film, and when things were still looking good for him at Universal, they already announced that what they were going to have him do after this was Bluebeard, which is another horror film that doesn't make for another near a decade when he's at PRC. And the Horrible Imaginings Festival this September in San Diego, they're actually going to do a 35 millimeter print, a screening of a 35 millimeter print of Bluebeard, not the Black Cat, but Bluebeard, at 7 p.m. on the Sunday, the 13th of September. And I'm going to fly out there for it, and I'm really excited about that. But the Black Cat has had a similar, you know, it's also made the rounds of these different horror festivals, and, you know, and it's screened, of course, on, you know, late night television. Lots of, as you can imagine, lots and lots of Halloween screenings. And part of that, I think, is that people, you know, bona fide horror fans are, you know, kind of gravitate towards it. Cult movie fans gravitate toward it, and also I think it's got a kind of campy element that people enjoy. I mean, part of it, when, you know, I was saying moments ago how it's really quite, you know, packs a mean punch and it's still kind of terrifying, but there are other moments where you just kind of laugh because it's so silly. And again, it's unclear to me whether some of that was really intended or whether that's just part of, you know, watching a film that's so corny from the 1930s and watching it through 21st century eyes.
Well, another interesting thing connecting Bluebeard and Black Cat is the presence of John Carradine.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And here he just sees his back is to the camera. Carradine does link the two, and Carradine was one of Ulmer's favorite actors, and he worked with him on, you know, well, first the Black Cat and then Monsoon in 43. It's sometimes called Isle of Forgotten Sins, where he plays this well, he's kind of a pirate of sorts. And then, of course, Bluebeard a year later. Both those films, Monsoon or Isle of Forgotten Sins, I can't remember. I think it's in the UK that it was released under the name Monsoon. In the U.S. it was Isle of Forgotten Sins. But Ulmer had worked with John Carradine, rather, since the 30s, and really held him in very high esteem. You know, Carradine was this Shakespearean-trained actor, and Ulmer, I think, really placed a great deal of stock in that kind of classical training. And Carradine, perhaps even more significant, actually came and lived with the Ulmer family for a good long period. He was the man who came to dinner and basically never left. He came with his son. He was hiding from his then, trying to avoid alimony payments, really, from his then wife, and he ended up living with the Ulmers. So he became really an important member of the family, so to speak, the acting family, and then also really, there are great stories. He once there was at the Garden of Allah, this hotel, and the swimming pool, the Garden of Allah. Ariane, as a young girl, was drowning. Apparently, he jumped in and saved her. So he was sort of had. Figured with considerable prominence in the Ulmer family lore, and more important than that, there was definitely one of the many actors that I should put differently, one of the few actors actually that Ulmer collaborated with over and over again. You could add others to that list, but I think that Carradine was definitely one of his favorites. Even if in The Black Cat, his role is really rather minimal. I think this was, so to speak, the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
I have to say I was very impressed with Harry Cording in the film. He is so menacing.
That, too, is another kind of he's the way that he's portrayed. He's menacing, and he's almost like a kind of golem figure. And I think that as Tamil, I think that Ulmer was, especially, look at the way that he's described in the shooting script. I think that was something that he was after in this character. But yes, he's absolutely menacing. And even was it Egon Becher, who was like Ulmer, was born in Olmütz, who plays Major Domo, right? He's also kind of a creepy character in the film. I mean, the casting is I think well done in this film. That's not always the case in Ulmer's films, especially in some of the others with an even smaller budget. I mean, this film came in just under $100,000, and it brought in close to $500,000 at the box office. So not very bad there, despite what actually happened to Ulmer after, sort of in its immediate aftermath. I mean, this is quite a successful production if you think about it in those terms, and those were precisely the terms in which films were measured and continue to be measured. That's what Uncle Carl was most concerned with, and in fact, that's why when he saw the rough cut of the film and was so concerned with the especially the use of the classical music, he thought of that as box office poison. He thought, to fill the film with that much classical music, it would just ensure disaster at the box office, and he was completely mistaken. I mean, it was a film that was at least said to have been Universal's highest grossing film that year. I've never spent time to confirm that. I mean, that's written about a number of places, and I've sort of taken different relatively reputable scholars and film historians at their word on that, but I've never gone to the I mean, I've worked in the files for this film, but I haven't looked at all of the other films to see, look at the box office returns and see whether that's in fact true. But in any case, the fact that a film that was made for a little under $100,000 brought in nearly $500,000 at the box office, that's pretty darn impressive. Those are not normally the terms with which I evaluate Ulmer's work, but I think at this early stage in his career, it's a pretty important sort of benchmark for him. There are very few films of his some 35-year career as a director that ever, reached that level of commercial success. That has to be noted with a film like The Black Cat. But yes, the casting, I'm sure, has to do something with that. I think that was they did a great job, and they they chose some talented actors. I mean, even the sort of the vaudeville Borscht shtick, the two, the sergeant and the lieutenant. That's Henry Armetta and Albert Conti. I mean, it's a small number for them, and it's just sort of tongue in cheek, but they do a good job with it. And Ulmer was never really a terribly talented director when it came to directing comedy, but he does a decent job there. It's with a wink and a nudge, but it's done well.
So what are you working on these days?
I am in the thick of writing a book about a very different subject. It's sort of the un-Ulmer. I'm writing about one of the most commercially successful films of its era. I'm writing about the afterlife of Casablanca and movie love. How Casablanca, the working subtitle of the book is How Casablanca Taught Us to Love Movies. So it's a very, very different film. Certainly a very different film. It's a very, very different book. And a lot of it will be built around reporting interviews like this, talking with different people. And there's already been an excellent Algene Harmetz who used to write. She was sort of a Hollywood reporter for the New York Times, and has also wrote a lot of obits for the Times. She did a book. I think the first one was on The Wizard of Oz, but then she did this round of The Usual Suspects, which is a history sort of the production. That's already been done. So the book won't be so much a production history as it is about the afterlife, how Casablanca continues to occupy this very, very prominent position in the history of motion pictures and pretty much all celebrations of certainly of Hollywood, but perhaps of movies in general, but certainly of Hollywood. We'll always have a screening of Casablanca. It's the single film in the history of motion pictures that has enjoyed the most revival screenings, and I think it's also to this point has been broadcast more on television than any other film. So that's something that I've been working on, and I'll be working on. I'm on sabbatical next year, and I'll be finishing it up over the course of the next several months into the academic year. It's unclear when it will be completely wrapped up, but I'm hoping to have it all finished by spring of 2016. The idea is to have it appear for the 75th anniversary of the film, which is in November of 2017, and is aimed really specifically at a popular audience, not at an academic audience. The Ulmer biography was published by the University of California Press, and California's been very good, I think, at reaching a non-academic audience, but the Casablanca book is really very, very specifically pitched at a popular audience.
Noah sells out.
Oh man, guilty as charged. When you work this hard on these projects, why not also at least be able to squirrel away a little bit to help pay for your kids' tuition and that sort of thing? So yes, I'm not gonna try to dig myself out of that one.
You are known, you're known on Twitter, but you're known otherwise as the Philly Poe Guy. Why the Philly Poe Guy?
I'm known as the Philly Poe Guy because I preach the Philadelphia Poe gospel, in that Philadelphia was the place where Poe lived that really shaped the things, the macabre things that he wrote. And it was, I think, the most important city he lived in as far as the literary canon is concerned. I mean, most of the works we read of Poe were either written in Philadelphia or, inspired by his time in Philadelphia. So I give a lot of public lectures on Philadelphia Poe and, his time here.
When did you first encounter his work?
I first encountered the works of Poe in school, but I don't remember how early it was. A lot of people have those great, Poe stories where, I was sick and I was at my grandmother's and there was this old volume on the shelf and I pulled it out and I fell in love. I don't have one of those origin stories, and I think part of the part of the Philly Poe thing for me is that growing up in Philadelphia, I always knew about Poe, and I was a big horror fan, that kind of thing anyway. So it was just kind of, Poe was just that horror god that was always out there, and I was always aware of him. So I can't tell you when I first encountered Poe, because it seems like he's been ever present to me.
Do you have a favorite Poe story?
My favorite Poe story that's not that well known is Man of the Crowd, which is this bizarre story set supposedly in London. That's where it says in the story it's set, but he wrote it in Philadelphia, and as the character walks around this nightmarish, falling apart, derelict, phantasmagoric city, it sounds like he's describing Philadelphia in 1840, around when he wrote it. And I love that story because it's also a mystery story in a sense. Someone sees this old man from a coffee shop window, and he assumes that this man, he looks at him and can tell this is the most evil man on the face of the earth, and he has to find out his secret. Knows nothing about whether this guy's evil or not, just can tell by the way he looks, and he follows him over the course of this long night, and to give the end of the story away, he doesn't come up with an answer. And for Poe to write that story at a time when he's also writing his Dupin mysteries and has invented the mystery detective story, the mystery detective story is famed for reassuring us all that even when a crime is inexplicable and no one can figure it out, there is someone who can, and kind of provides us all with safety at solving that crime. And in Man of the Crowd, you get to the end, and it's the opposite message. It's that we'll never know what evil lurks, in the hearts of those walking around that we see every day. And it's a very scary thing. I love that story.
How about a favorite adaptation?
There's two great flowering of Poe movies, and one of them is the Roger Corman movies, which I love. And probably Fall of the House of Usher, his first, is my favorite of those. But the first flowering are the three Universal movies in the 60s, Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Black Cat, and The Raven. And I love each of those for very different reasons. And they're all bizarre and extreme and crazy horror films, and especially to be made at the time in the early 30s.
Let's talk about The Black Cat. Can you kind of summarize what the story is that The Black Cat tells?
The Black Cat is a first-person narrative told by someone who's about to be hung for murdering his wife. And we get he tells the story of his life and how he came to do this, commit this horrific crime, and how he was caught. And it's also kind of a bizarre horror temperance tale. There were a lot of temperance tales written in the mid-19th century, and Poe's is also kind of a temperance tale because it's about a drunkard and how drink has driven him to do depraved things. And in the story, he talks about his early life and how he was always loved animals, even as a child, and had all kinds of pets. He even had a pet monkey. And then when he's older and he meets this woman and they get married, and he has this pet black cat named Pluto that he loves dearly. And as he continues to drink and become an alcoholic, he gets mean. He starts, yelling at his wife and mistreating her, and he starts mistreating the cat as well. And he describes it as he doesn't have a reason for hurting the cat. He does it out of perverseness. He does it out of this kind of desire to do something really wrong. And one time he grabs the cat and he cuts its eye out. And then the cat, of course, stops coming to him and won't come to him every day because he's scared it so much. And then one day the cat comes and he catches it and he hangs the cat in his backyard from a tree. His house burns down. He continues, and it's this one thing after another. As he continues to drink and his life spirals out of control, he loses everything. And then one day he's in a bar after he's killed the cat, and another black cat shows up. And curiously, this cat also has no eye where he cut out the eye of his cat, and on its chest is it's all black except for on its chest in white is what looks like a hangman's gallows is kind of done in hair on its chest, and he thinks this is strange, but he brings the cat home anyway, and that cat stays with him for a bit, and then one day his wife, he gets angry at his, he's going down the basement stairs for something, and the cat gets tangled on his legs, and he almost trips and falls, and he raises up, and he grabs an axe, and he raises it up, and he's going to kill the cat, and his wife stops him and grabs his arm and says, don't do it. So he turns to his wife instead and buries the axe in her head. Buries her in the basement behind a wall. He walls her up, her corpse up, in the basement. Doesn't know where the cat went. Where's this cat? It's gone now. Better not come back. Walls his wife up in the basement. Does such a great job. He's so proud of himself. Goes up to bed. Sleeps well. He says, this is the first time I've, had a good night's sleep in ages now that she's gone. The police show up the next day looking for his wife, and he takes them down to the basement. There's no way they can tell this beautiful wall I've built. They'll never know that she's buried behind it, and he starts bragging about it, and he's tapping on the wall. Look how solid this wall is. This is great construction in this house. And this wail comes out, this long, horrific wail, and the police are startled, and he's startled, and the police say, he's behind the wall, and they knock the wall down, and there's his dead wife behind the wall, and the cat is on his wife, and it was the cat that made the wail, and he is caught, and, that is his life story. So the interesting thing about the story is that you can read it straightforward like that. That's the plot. There's one cat, then there's another cat, and then the cat gives him away at the end. And there's also a strange way of looking at it, and the second cat might not exist. The second cat may be a kind of figment of his imagination, that it might not necessarily be the physical manifestation of the first cat coming back for revenge. It may be kind of, an alcoholic hallucination that he has, and Poe doesn't tell us one way or the other, if that's true.
Now, I'm hearing elements in that of stuff like the Cask of Amontillado and maybe even a little Telltale Heart. Where does this kind of fit into his bibliography?
Well, the Black Cats of Philadelphia story. Cask of Amontillado is actually a story he wrote later when he was in New York, and another revenge story where someone gets walled up, but much more masterfully done, the Cask of Amontillado. That's like one of those masterpiece stories that he spent his whole life writing and creating this kind of revenge or murder story, and he perfects it in Cask. But the Black Cat and Telltale Heart, they're both in the Philadelphia days, and they both really represent this kind of change in the way Poe approaches horror. They have very Gothic elements in these stories, and setting and mood and the way things are described, but earlier Gothic tales of Poe and of everyone, who writes, Gothic tales are often Gothic tales in the 19th century are grounded in the European Gothicism, where there's a supernatural element involved. And Poe also writes tales like that, but it's after he comes to Philadelphia and imbibes what I like to call Philadelphia Gothic, which is a kind of realistic urban horror that had been written in Philadelphia since the end of the 18th century by Charles Brockden Brown on up to Poe, in which the horrors aren't supernatural anymore. They could be a drunkard who you're married to in your house. It could be, someone just living with you, in an undefined relationship, like the narrator who kills the old man in The Telltale Heart. Poe's horrors move from this realm of hereditary curses, like in Fall of the House of Usher, that's early on, and then develop into these urban nightmares that happened in Telltale Heart and Black Cat. Coincidentally enough, too, in 1839 in Philadelphia, there was a murder that happened in Philadelphia. James Wood was the murderer's name, and he killed his daughter. His daughter had secretly married someone that the father didn't approve of, and tried to keep it a secret for a while. The daughter came home and finally admitted to it, and her father literally brought her in an embrace as if to forgive her, and had a pistol in his hand, raised it up, and shot her in the head. Went to trial, big trial in Philadelphia at the time, in early 1840. Edgar Allan Poe is had only been in the city for about a year and a half at that time, is just getting some scrap journalistic work, and goes to the trial and covers the trial for one of the weekly newspapers at the time, and writes about James Wood getting James Wood getting acquitted of the crime. They find him not guilty by reason of insanity. That such was his, mental condition at his daughter disobeying him that he went momentarily crazy and killed her, and they freed him. Actually, he went and spent a little bit of time in an asylum, and then he was released. But Poe covered the trial and remarked about how calm and cool and collected Wood described how he went and purchased the guns and how he planned to kill, his daughter. And Poe thought that had he been raving and manic and in describing this murder, people would have assumed, well, he's so crazy. But Poe thought just the opposite. Poe thought the fact that he was so calm in describing it, that was the key to realizing how insane that he was. Poe uses that trial. He uses some of the same words in The Telltale Heart. You get some of the murder talking about how calmly, how coolly he did things. The same details show up in The Black Cat. So Poe uses this murder that he, that he read about, and from the trial that he covered in Philadelphia, and he uses some of those details for the murderers and his stories.
This story was adapted a few times for the big screen. I think that there was definitely a Lucio Fulci version. I want to say that Two Evil Eyes used some of it, and I remember that was kind of what turned me off of Argento for a long time, was Two Evil Eyes. But most famously, the 1934 version, which sounds like it has absolutely nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe.
It has nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe. Black Cat with Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. It says in the beginning of the film, it says, suggested by the immortal Edgar Allan Poe classic. But of course, the only connection is that Bela Lugosi's character is, afraid of black cats, like terrified. He sees them and he cowers, onto the floor against the wall when he's just at the sight of a black cat. And that's the only connection. Unless you want to play up the kind of thematic elements of it, the kind of as Karloff says in the film, are we both not the living dead? It's a movie about the dead kind of returning for revenge, and that's kind of a theme in the story, and that's in the film as well. And the black cat itself. At one point in the film, Lugosi, the first time he sees the cat, he cowers, and then he grabs a knife and he throws it, and you get the impression that he's hit the cat and perhaps killed it with a knife. But they don't say anything about it. And then later, the cat again shows up as he's about to shoot Karloff, and then he sees the cat, he's afraid, and he drops the gun. So even that element, that there's a cat that it seems as if he's killed and then it returns. But that's it. It's not really it's not a Poe adaptation. And Universal had done, and this is that first flowering. I mean, Universal had just done Dracula and Frankenstein and The Mummy, and they decided, hey, let's do Poe. And this is the first time Poe's really done on film, as horror stories. There'd been a few sporadic here. There's some silent, biopics of Poe. D.W. Griffith made a biopic of Poe. But this is a conscious effort from a studio to say, let's play up the horror. Let's make horror movies and let's use Poe. So they start with Murders in the Rue Morgue with Lugosi, and then The Black Cat, and then The Raven, and The Raven after The Black Cat, that's Karloff and Lugosi, and it's about a guy that Lugosi plays who's obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe and his works. And so the movie's really about someone's obsession with Poe, which makes it very interesting as well. All of these films, increasingly, they kind of use less of Poe's plots and ideas, but they're really crucial. They're really crucial in establishing Edgar Allan Poe as that kind of master of the macabre in American popular culture. American literature is kind of only It's in the schools at the time. It's not really taught the way they teach it now, where you get poems and stories and then you read them and you analyze them and there's classroom discussion about them. It's more of either learning poems by heart, recitation, or looking at kind of American literary history, and that's what American literature textbooks are like for kids in school then. And you see Poe's place in American literary history. Poe's taught as kind of to children, and not to college at all. College wouldn't touch Poe until probably the 50s or maybe the 1960s. Poe's taught as this kind of an important contributor to American literature, and then maybe the students would read the stories and poems either in class or perhaps on their own. But with movies now, with what Universal did with them, movies moved Poe into this broader pop culture stream. Movies take him out of that purely literary thing, and they establish him in the pop culture realm, and that's really the beginning of Poe on a much wider basis. October every year isn't a Halloween month. It's Poe month for me. Everybody wants to do Poe stuff and know about Poe, and I think you can trace it back to really movies using him. And they marketed it on purpose that way. I have a thing here from the press book from the publicity department from Universal, and for the Black Cat, here's a quote: "Because of the tremendous reputation which Edgar Allan Poe enjoys, his words are used in many literature classes throughout American schools. Under the circumstances, tie-ups with the showing of your picture should be easily arranged. Contact principals or teachers in your locality and arrange for visits of pupils to see the picture in groups, or to stimulate extra interest, sponsor an essay contest on the subject of Edgar Allan Poe's life, or why Black Cat can be considered one of his most outstanding masterpieces. Be sure that bulletins or cards announcing your showing appear in every school and at spots patronized by school children." I can just imagine some school teacher in 1932 taking her kids to see Black Cat with Lugosi and Karloff, and the horror, the true life horror that would have gone through their brains at watching this man getting flayed alive, and these kind of hints at necrophilia and stuff that's got nothing to do with Poe's story. But Universal and Universal did that with all its films. They did it with Murders in a Rue Morgue, they did it with Black Cat, and they did it with The Raven. That they really, part of their publicity, part of their marketing for it was to reach out to children to come see them. I can't imagine my kids going to see these guys. My kids don't watch these movies now. And I can't imagine that this would have been considered, proper. But, I mean, of course, Universal, that's about making money. And they're always willing to play. And later this happened, too, with AIP and Roger Corman. I mean, they make a couple Poe films that aren't about Poe at all. Or they make The Raven, with battling wizards, with Karloff and Peter Lorre and Vincent Price, and it's got nothing to do with Poe's poem. They make one film and they name it after a Poe poem, The Haunted Palace, and it's actually an H.P. Lovecraft story. And they just have this quote from Poe's poem in the beginning of the film, and then they do the story, and then it ends, and it's an Edgar Allan Poe film, but it's not an Edgar Allan Poe film. It's about marketing the name, and very much with this film in the middle between Murders in a Rue Morgue and The Raven. The Black Cat in 1932 was really just about using Poe's name. People know that he writes horror tales, so here's horror for you.
Now, if folks want to get more in touch with Edgar Allan Poe, is there a good biography of him, or is it still have yet to be written?
The standard biography is the Kenneth Silverman one, Edgar Allan Poe, A Mournful and Never-Ending Remembrance. I hate that biography, though, so I tend not to recommend that for people. It's very updated, maybe written in the late 80s or something like that. Very updated, good scholarship about his life and what he did. But Silverman doesn't seem to like Poe very much and really goes off on that kind of bent where he makes sure that he overemphasizes all the bad stuff about Poe, which, if you're looking at his whole life, is just few and far between anyway. I think the best biography of Poe is by Arthur Hobson Quinn. I can't remember when it came out. It was sometime in the 1930s, but it's a great biography, and it's written very well. And there's another book by a poet who just died a couple years ago, a Philadelphia poet by the name of Daniel Hoffman. Wrote a great book that is called Poe, 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 which is a take on the bells, poem. And it is a magnificent book from a poet's perspective about this great American, poet, writer. It's very idiosyncratic, very unusual book, but completely fascinating to read. So that's my favorite Poe book. I actually met Daniel. First time I ever met Daniel Hoffman, I said, "Oh my gosh, your Poe book is my favorite book." And he said, "Mine too."
If there was one story for folks to read to get them into Poe, what would that one be for you?
If you're looking to get into Poe, and especially the whole horror angle, you can't go wrong with Telltale Heart. That is the story that's used to get people into Poe. It's very short. It's a monologue from a murderer, and it is pitch perfect, beautifully written. There's so many great little details in it that really stand out, and you remember it. You can read it out loud. It's really thrilling to really read out loud, too. So probably the Telltale Heart. Now remember, Poe writes across the genres. Poe writes a lot of satires. His horror stories are, a third of the fiction that he wrote. So whatever you pick of Poe, it's going to be representative of one kind of thing that he wrote, but, it's just a fraction of everything. And Murders in the Rue Morgue, which I always recommend to people, is the first mystery detective story in fiction ever written in the English language. And it's bizarre, and it has a really weird ending that people don't expect. And I also recommend Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Now, when it comes to biopics of him, now you're a big proponent of the John Cusack film, correct?
Boy, I reviewed the Raven with Cusack for Cinetelphia when it came out, and I was. Hey, he's got a pet raccoon in it named. What's the raccoon's name? I can't remember the raccoon's name. But I thought, if you're going to have a biopic about Poe, give him a pet raccoon. That's kind of, fun and interesting. But I hate the Cusack movie because it just buys into all the Poe is a half-crazed, drunk kind of stereotype, which is number one, not true about his real life, but also it's just a cheap way to kind of align him with some of the crazier stories that he wrote, and that, well, if he wrote this crazy stuff, he must have been crazy in some way, and that's just absurd. So, and it's a dumb movie, and the whole mystery of the movie is awful, and you get to the end, you find out the killer is, you're like, what? That's dumb. and then there's this, and then Poe is completely ineffectual, and it's somebody else that has to catch the killer, and Poe just like, I guess I lose everything, and goes to a park bench and sits and dies. And the whole movie had been portraying him as this kind of, had been building him up as this kind of heroic figure that I'm going to solve the crime, I'm going to save the day. I like that about taking authors and making them into these kind of heroic figures. And for the Poe one, it does that, and it just drops it, and it's just, that's a mess, that movie. So that was very disappointing. So, and it's all Baltimore centered. Poe's in Baltimore. He wasn't in Baltimore then, and that's ridiculous. I hate that.
Well, you are the Philly Poe guy.
So I have to represent for Philly Poe. So
that's right. Do you have anything that you want to plug?
I'm doing posts around Philly, because of October comes up, and I go out and I read Poe's poetry at places. I'm doing that at one of the libraries, and I'm doing a Poe seminar, which I'm really excited about, with the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia is a great book museum, book collection, amassed by S.W. Rosenbach in the early 20th century, and now it's a museum. They have the manuscript of James Joyce's Ulysses. They have Bram Stoker's Notes for Dracula. They just acquired a first edition Frankenstein. I think that's the only one in the Philadelphia area. They're part of the free library system of Philadelphia, so I'm going to go in and do a seminar and for 5 Saturdays from October until the first Saturday of December, we'll meet in the rare book department at the Free Library of Philadelphia, which has an enormous Poe collection, and they have Grip the Raven, Charles Dickens' Raven, that probably inspired Poe to use the Raven for his poem, and we're going to talk about Poe's works and stories, and it'll be a lot of fun, and it'll be nice to just teach Poe, and that's what I get to do.
Many songs have been written about the faithful dog, the strong horse, the dragon, and the kangaroo. But I'm persuaded that the most faithful, unforgettable character of all is the home-loving cat. And this is his true story. Now, old Uncle John had troubles of his own, had an old yellow cat that wouldn't leave home. He tried everything he knew to keep the cat away, even gave it to a preacher and he told him for it to stay. But the cat came back, the cat came back. I thought it was a goner, but the cat came back, 'cause he wouldn't stay away.
We're back, and we're talking about The Black Cat. Now, the film is 81 years old. It might actually be the oldest film we've covered so far. That is until we cover Hexen in October. So how does the film hold up with time? What do you think, our special guest co-host, Miss Maitland?
I think it holds up incredibly well. First, it's incredibly stylistically sophisticated. Everything about the way it's staged, shot, set directed is extraordinary. And frankly, the acting is surprisingly good for mostly a cast of people who were just regular contract players, but also Bela Lugosi, who was not a bad actor by any stretch of the imagination, but who did tend to act for the stage rather than for the screen. And there are a number of moments in this film where I think his performance is really remarkably sophisticated and makes the incredible tragedy at this film's heart, which is the tragedy of people who have been destroyed by the past. Two men who were part of that past, and then this young couple who aren't part of it but get sucked into it by sheer coincidence. They're taking a train to Vienna, there's an accident, they wind up in this old dark house in the middle of the night, drawn into this horrible drama playing out between Poelzig and Verdigast that has its roots in things that happened almost 20 years ago when the American couple were kids. I mean, what do you think they are, maybe 25?
Yeah, if that.
Yeah, so they were kids when all of this happened, and I'm sure they heard about it from their parents and their grandparents, but it's ancient history to them, and they get sucked back into it like the jaws of hell have just closed around their hips. So I think it's a very resonant story that pretty much everybody living in today's world can identify with, because I think most of us have either had the experience of having to push past something that happened in our past that it was difficult and damaging, but that you either had to get past or you let it destroy your life, or have known people who have had that experience. Experiences that often come from war, but also from, sexual abuse, family abuse, all kinds of things that can mire you in the past and keep you from moving forward with your life. This movie really dramatizes that kind of struggle extremely effectively and is, as you said, 80 years old. It's real proof that times change, but people and their problems really don't.
Yeah, it's funny. Usually on this show, we're talking about Watergate, the assassination of JFK, about Vietnam, but really the more things change, the more they stay the same, because the same effects that we talk about when it comes to nations in mourning about Vietnam, here we are talking about nations in mourning when it comes to World War I. Just different folks being put in a different place, and having an emigre director definitely helps us speak to that as far as that being at the core of this film, and it really does have that same kind of resonance that we're going to see in something like a Coming Home or any of the post-Vietnam films, or even the ones that we talk about on here where we don't necessarily think that that is at the core of the film, but has that long shadow that reaches over it.
Actually, it's a movie that really makes me think about Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, which is very much tied up with post-war traumatic syndrome in relation to World War I. And that's often not what people focus on when they talk about that book. They talk about, the struggle of middle-class and upper-middle-class women in a changing world. But there's an enormous subplot that involves soldiers who have come back from the First World War who are completely destroyed by the experience and whom Mrs. Dalloway encounters in her day-to-day life. So I think this was something that was very much in the air at that time, and that artists of all kinds, from Edgar Ulmer making a relatively low-budget horror movie to Virginia Woolf writing a literary novel, were attempting to grapple with.
And either they would have been affected personally, or they would have known people, or they would have had friends who were in there, family members who have been through that. So it's just something that's playing out in the background. And it's interesting how they can work it in, how they can put it in there without it being sort of like hammering it. Because one of the worst things you can do, I think, as an artist or as a creative person is just to go, see, it's about the war, and just keep like jabbing you in the ribs, because there's nothing more artless than jabbing you in the ribs when you're trying to make a point.
How do you guys feel about the score for the film? I know that was definitely something that was under contention when it came to Carl Lammel and what he thought that the movie should be, but I think personally that it works very well as far as this kind of wall-to-wall classical music or playing off of themes of other classical songs, but I can see where it might be a little much for people these days.
It works for me. I actually think that one of the things with the earlier Universal films in like 31 and all of that stuff is that they feel longer because they're quieter. There's not the constant running music and all of that other stuff, and I actually think the pieces that they pick in here are quite good. The one thing that I had to laugh to myself about, and now it's become such a cliche because of overuse, is the whole organ piece that's in there, and how whenever...
Oh, the toccata and fugue?
Yeah. And that's another thing where if you're a modern viewer and you don't put yourself in the mindset of 80 years ago, you're going to go, oh, that fucking piece of music. I've heard that thing so many times. And so, it made me laugh because when I thought of it, I go, yeah, well, of course, whenever there's somebody playing that piece in a film that's at the organ, of course they play it like note perfect. And it's always like the most grand presentation of it too.
Although the thing I think that works best in this film is the Tchaikovsky from Romeo and Juliet, which is that theme that was later turned into the song Strangers in Paradise, or Stranger in Paradise, from Romeo and Juliet. And I think that actually works enormously well. And certainly builds on what I think music directors were starting to do earlier. I think one of the places everybody has seen it is in Dracula, where there's a huge chunk of Swan Lake. Again, Tchaikovsky, that's used in that film. But I think here the music is remarkably effective, frankly. And I wonder whether an original score would have been more effective, and I think probably not. I'm a little bit at sea here because, quite honestly, my understanding of how much classical music the ordinary person was familiar with at that time is a little bit sketchy, but I also think that more people were more familiar with things like the big popular classical composers' works, like pretty much all the works of Tchaikovsky, than people are today. I think more people would probably have recognized Romeo and Juliet or chunks of Swan Lake then than would have recognized them now. and understood that they were big romantic classical pieces that had a particular resonance.
Which would have been the major source of entertainment for people at the time, would have been radio. And most radio stations in major cities had their own orchestras, and they played a lot of classical music on the air at the time. So between that and then also going to film, where you may have certain performances that could be organ if it was during the silent era, or a small orchestra, I think people would have been much more familiar with classical pieces, even though they may not have known who the composer was or what piece went where in that particular way. I think they definitely would have been more versed in it than today, where you really have to kind of seek it out. If you want classical music, you're either listening to a public radio station or you're going to the symphony, or, you know, your kid plays violin and therefore you have to listen to it, you know, when they're going to school or whatever. But it's, I think it was much more upfront in the time, because, I mean, what, in the 20s, 30s, you had, okay, maybe like some Tin Pan Alley kind of stuff, early jazz, but even that was kind of marginalized at the time.
And one of the things I actually noticed with this film, as compared, say, to a film like Dracula, was that you have music absolutely throughout, which is, I think, remarkably effective. You know, I think that when you look at Dracula, you're looking at a film where, and that's only 3 years earlier, where filmmakers, studio heads were trying to figure out what the function of music in movies was. And we're trying to decide, well, what's too much? What sets a tone, what's going to interrupt people's attention and draw them out of the fiction. And in this film, it really is very thoroughly integrated in a way that I think is very effective. I watched this movie again this afternoon, and for big chunks of it, I really wasn't aware of the music, except to the degree that I was aware, because I was attempting to be aware of everything that was going on, because I was going to talk about it.
The only thing that I can think of that would have been sort of more music than film at the time would have been full musicals on Broadway or something. Because, granted, you didn't have like a running score the whole time, but at least you had more songs and more music through those things. And that would have been really the only reference for people to have that much music in one piece, in one sitting of watching something.
And that's actually quite interesting because, of course, this movie isn't a musical. It's not all about the music. It is definitely all about the drama and the angst and the perversity of everything. And yet there is pervasive music throughout. So it's again, I'm not familiar enough with the history of the development of the use of music in movies in the 30s to really speak definitively to it. But I think it's surprisingly sophisticated for a time when people really were kind of throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck.
And also they were up against the technological challenges, because I remember reading up and watching things on Dracula, and at the time they had to put the camera in this big box because, of course, it made a bunch of noise, and most of that had to be recorded live. They couldn't really go in and mix and punch post as much as you could just a few years later. So I'm sure by this time technology had advanced a little bit that allowed them to do a little bit more mixing. They didn't have to do everything live, like have some guy on the side of the stage doing, sound effects and all of that other stuff.
Yeah, but I think the phrase, "we'll fix it in post," was definitely not a watch phrase in the way that it's later.
No, definitely not.
When we were talking offline a little bit about this, Maitland, you brought up the works of Max Castle, which sometimes I like to treat Max Castle like he wasn't a fictional creation and just think of him as being a real filmmaker who would be very similar to Edgar Ulmer. But Max Castle is a fictional character, as far as we know, from one of my favorite books, and it sounds like one of yours as well, called Flicker. So can you let our audience know where he plays into something like the Black Cat?
Well, first of all, Flicker is one of my very favorite topics to talk about. I like to think that I have steered more people to buying copies of Flicker than, the next 10 people next to me on the subway, because it is one of my favorite novels. It was written by Theodore Roxack in, I think, 1991, but I didn't become aware of it for probably 15 years after that. It's a novel that involves a graduate student in film at the beginning of the time when you could actually be a graduate student in film, who is working on a master's thesis about an old Hollywood filmmaker named Max Castle, who is very clearly based on Edgar G. Ulmer, and who, as the novel proceeds, is proved to be somebody who is involved with something far darker than just filmmaking, and that's about all I think I need to say about the novel. But Ulmer is very clearly the model for Castle. He's a European filmmaker with sensibilities far above the level of the films that he was able to make in Hollywood, which is certainly Ulmer, and who, the novel posits, was tapped into a very dark stream of something that's being expressed through the medium of cinema. I don't want to say too much more about it because I would love people to read Flicker and have the same enjoyment I had when I first read it of finding out exactly what was going on. I think you'll probably agree with me on that.
Oh, completely. Yeah, this was a book that I loved Flicker so much that I think a few months after I read it, it was right around Christmas time, I ended up buying multiple copies of it and shipping it over to friends just so I had people that I could talk to about this book because I loved it so much. And it just affected me so much because it had that wonderful blend of fiction and reality that I love so much, and you don't necessarily know where one ends and the other begins.
What I loved about Flicker, I think, was that it is so suffused with a love of cinema, and yet it posits that film can be a very dark thing.
There are things happening between the frames.
And I think that's really about all we want to say about the secrets of Flicker. But it is a terrific, terrific novel. And I actually met the author of it under circumstances that I think one could never have predicted. I was working at TV Guide, and we were doing something that involved In Red Line, Terrence Malick's film, and the producers of that film, Bobby Giesler and John or Robert Roberdeau, who were the producers, were working on a new project that they didn't really want to talk about, but they still wanted people to cover it. I think anybody who's ever worked in any kind of writing will understand that. And they put together a big event to kind of announce the project they weren't doing yet, which turned out to be Flicker. They wanted to do an adaptation of Flicker. And I was invited primarily because of my Argento book, because they felt that, Argento might actually be a director who could direct Flicker, which was a terrible, terrible idea, but that's a whole other thing. But I wound up sitting across the table for dinner with Theodore Roszak and talking about Flicker, and all I could think was, wow, I don't love my life from beginning to end, but this is a truly great moment.
Yeah, I read years ago, right after Fight Club, I think it was, Jim Olds had written a adaptation of it, and unfortunately I was not a big fan of that. There was supposed to be, I'm not sure if it was the Olds draft of the screenplay that was supposed to be the one that Darren Aronofsky was going to be adapting, or what was happening around there, but Aronofsky, as we all know, has had his name attached to so many things over the years, and Flicker was one of them, and I do think that if anyone were to be able to bring Flicker to the big screen, then Aronofsky is one of the people that I would like to see take a stab at it.
I'm in total agreement. He is somebody whom I think maybe would not make the Flicker I would like to see made, but who would make a Flicker that was true to the novel and was imaginative and transgressive, because God knows that's a transgressive novel, and fascinating, frankly. Probably not a commercial hit, but that's a whole other issue.
We asked you, Maitland, if the film stands up. You definitely said yes. Rob, what do you think? Do you think that folks should still see The Black Cat?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. I think that it's a great piece, especially if people have only seen Frankenstein and only seen Dracula and haven't had a chance to get deeper into both Lugosi and Karloff. I mean, the other one that I like, and Maitland brought it up earlier, is Old Dark House. That's one that I like with Karloff as well. So it's great to see that and to sort of see how they we're still kind of working it out. And I know the one thing that you said was, well, some people don't want to watch black and white film. Well, forget them. I know that some people get kind of weirded out by sort of the acting style. They find it corny, or they find it, way too stagey and theatrical, and especially sometimes some of the line deliveries and ways that Lugosi's doing what he's doing. But one has to understand that really it took about another 20 years before the concept of any sort of quote-unquote realism in acting really became the regular method of doing it. And to me, it's interesting because I've talked about this before, me being a radio guy and have worked in radio for 14 years, that film and radio kind of follow each other in that way, because back in the 30s, there were those big announcer voices, and it was okay to be the big announcery guy. And then there was a time when it was more just your voice. However that person sounded, they didn't have to sound perfect, and that was okay. And film kind of went the same way, and that's what we're used to now, where we're used to people just acting like themselves, supposedly. And I think that if people take a step back and look at it and put it in context, much the way that you put it in context to, I don't know, go see Shakespeare play or, older work in that way, then you can really come to appreciate it in that way for those who aren't used to enjoying a broad range of film. For me, I didn't have a problem with it. I didn't have to be sort of, vaccinated against those biases the way that I think maybe some younger people might.
The thing I always think of was when I was teaching film at Hunter College, and I would sometimes run into students, who would have the response that you indicated to older films. They would find them stagey. They would find them artificial. They would have trouble connecting with them. I used to always show my students Double Indemnity because it was such a compelling and powerful movie. And after class, there was a girl who had never spoken up in class, ever, who was a very, very pulled-together young woman. She had really beautiful hair, beautiful nails, beautiful makeup. And she came up to me after class and said, "Oh, Professor McDonagh," because they all called me Professor. No matter how many times I said, "No, I'm just adjunct lecturer McDonagh," and said, "Professor McDonagh, I'd like to talk to you about this movie." And I said, "Great, talk to me about this movie." And she said, "I watched this movie, and I was thinking, I totally get that Phyllis woman, that Phyllis, and I said, Dietrichson. Yes, Phyllis Dietrichson." And she said, "Yeah, that Phyllis Dietrichson was a real high-maintenance woman." And then she went on to talk about the film itself and gave a very sophisticated analysis of why Walter Neff fell for her and what part of his attraction for her was real and what part was an attraction to an image and what part of it was purely self-destructive. And I came away from that thinking, I'm amazed by how smart people who think that they don't understand movies like this can be, because that girl understood this movie completely. She totally got what it was about, what the sexual dynamics were, what the social dynamics were, what the cultural dynamics were. And to me, that was evidence that old movies can be as completely compelling as new ones to young people.
All right, so we are going to take another break and play a preview for next week's show.
From the author of Taxi Driver comes Blue Collar, the story of three men who spend their whole lives working to catch up.
There's going to be some changes, man, in the union. Big changes.
Everybody know what the plant is. The plant just short for plantation.
I was on that picket line every day.
That's right.
I'm still paying the bills and the money out of bar to support my family.
Who is it?
Mr. Brown?
Yes?
Yeah, my name is Mr. Berg. I'm with the Internal Revenue.
I don't want none.
But according to the hospital records, you claim 6 and you only have 3.
I couldn't have all my kids in the hospital, man,
Here, see, we have Sugar Ray Brown, you got Gloria Brown, you got O.J. Brown, Gail Sayers Brown, Jim Brown, Stevie Wonder Brown. Who's Stevie Wonder?
I was going to come by your house and see you, but I figured maybe
listen,
to get...
man. Nobody comes near my house. Nobody I don't invite.
And you should be done with that now. You're behind schedule.
This is company time, Bartowski.
What are you telling me, man? That I'm going to be doing the work?
All 3 men? Let's move it, Zeke. You're dragging. You're always dragging the line.
Well, the thing I don't understand is why you let the union rip you off as much as management,
do my job. Can't nobody say no different. I was my own man when I came to work here. I'm gonna be my own man when I leave.
That safe you all the time talking about.
Keep it, man. That's our union. They ain't got nothing but one guard.
Here's the safe. We'll talk to it later. Let's get it out of here.
I kept the notebook.
Why? I thought you threw all that stuff out.
I hear you got something I want.
We can change the union with this book, baby.
Just leave me alone, man. I don't talk to no government agent.
We can't be seen with each other anymore. First of all, they know 3 guys dead, 2 of them are black, 1 of them are white.
I want no sense.
Nobody! Nobody back! We got the wrong house!
How do I protect my family?
I'm the only one who can protect you or your family.
You're my friend, Jerry. But you're thinking white.
The American dream. If you're rich, you can buy it. If you're anything else, you've got to fight for it. Blue Collar.
That's right. We'll be celebrating Labor Day with our episode on Blue Collar with director and writer Paul Schrader. And, of course, our special guest co-host Maitland McDonagh will also be back for that episode. So, speaking of, what is the latest with you? Last time we talked to you, you were working on some rather racy novels.
And I am still working on some rather racy novels. I'm about to publish a book called A Gay Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which is basically Kinky Boots meets Local Hero, in which a gaycation entrepreneur sets up a fabulous vacation in a faux Greek village and sets up a fake Olympics, and then finds that the Olympics actually take on a life of their own when all of the hustlers he's hired to just stand around and look good actually start competing, and it really changes the dynamic of the entire situation. It's a funny, clever, kind of socially and politically remarkably prescient book, and a lot of fun to read, and it will be available in early October.
Where can folks keep up with you with these books?
They can look up my name on Amazon.com and see all the things I've published recently, including all of these books.
Very cool. Well, hey, thank you so much, Maitland, for coming on the show. It is always a pleasure to talk to you. If folks want to hear more of Maitland, go back through our archives over at projection-booth.com. I think you've been on, at least 2 of our shows? Mostly when we talk about Dario Argento because of your wonderful book on the subject. But yeah, it is great having you on here talking about Black Cat, and I'm really looking forward to talking about Blue Collar. Go over to our website, projection-booth.com. We'll have links over to where you can buy Maitland's stuff, some amazing books. I love hearing about these titles that you're resurrecting and bringing out to the public at large here. So go over to projection-booth.com, leave us some feedback, head over to iTunes, leave us a review if you want. It's just going to help us take over the world.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.